In this video, I'm going to talk about, will my son become or marry a narcissist? Now, have no fear. If you have a daughter, the next video will be about daughters, okay? But it's a little bit different for sons versus daughters. The dynamic is different. Of course, it's everybody doesn't fit in a box. Different kids are different. But I know this is a big concern for a lot of parents, whether you have a son or a daughter. But the dynamic is a little different depending on, the gender of the child and the gender of the narcissistic parent, which also varies. But before I dive deeper on the son's topic, let me just remind you, if you like this content and find it helpful, don't forget to hit like on this video and also subscribe to the channel so that you get notified as new videos are released. I can tell you that I was very worried for my older son because he was 15 at the time of the divorce. So he had lived in the house exposed to the dynamic of mine and his father's relationship, for a long time. My other son was 11, so it wasn't quite as bad for him. And I think, a lot of times we stay in relationships because we see all the negatives for the kids, but a lot of times people don't see the positives that come, especially when you are dealing with a high conflict person on the other side and you have these sort of toxic relationship patterns that are happening, because the children learn that those toxic relationship patterns are normal. Now, with sons, I will say that if dad is the narcissist, a lot of times the higher risk is that the child will become narcissistic also. If mom is the narcissistic one with a son, then the higher likelihood is that they will marry a narcissist, right? And that's just simply out of, that male-female dynamic. The way we learn to relate to members of the opposite sex is through that opposite parent, right? That's where that comes from. So that's our first model of it, is the other parent. So when it is a son and a father that is narcissistic, I think one of the first things that you have to do, and I feel like I say this in every video about kids, but get the kid in therapy. That really is your first line of defense with these types of things, because a therapist is a neutral person that can help a child pick apart unhealthy dynamics in relationships, in any relationship, be it with their parents, their siblings, their teachers, their friends, their whatever. Just like when we go to therapy, it doesn't matter which relationship we're talking about. A therapist helps us analyze that from different angles, and to develop a skill set to be able to deal with that. So the first thing that you want to do is get your child into therapy so that they don't become that way. The other thing I think that you do is, and this is just kind of from my own personal perspective, is I really had to learn myself, right, and strengthen myself to be able to recognize when I thought one of the children was repeating a narcissistic type of pattern like that, and to choose to disengage from it and have a healthy boundary with it so that I didn't perpetuate that dynamic with them, right? Because with my son, if he's displaying behaviors that are narcissistic in nature, that are similar to what I experienced in my interaction with his dad, and I engage with him in the same codependent on my side, right, pattern in an unhealthy way, then again, I'm perpetuating the normalcy, the way that would feel normal to that child, because it's the only thing they know, right? So you can't do a whole lot about the exposure to the other parent's world. Again, I think that has to come through therapy, and you have to be the consistent parent, right, on your end, and you have to strengthen yourself and your ability to be able to recognize things that are happening and deal with them in a healthy way. As the child gets older, and depending on what their reaction to it is, to the other narcissistic parent is, you can kind of help them process, but you want to be really careful that you're not like villainizing the other parent in any way. So, for instance, my son used to come in and talk about how frustrated that he felt with his dad, and he felt like it was just always a fight. And I mean, he was a teenager, some of it was normal teenager dynamic, but he would just feel really, really frustrated and like he wasn't heard, like his dad wasn't listening to him and he did not feel heard. And so I did two things. One, I said, he's like, I don't want to go anymore. You got to talk to your dad about that, right? Like, that's not my parenting time. You and your dad's world. You got to talk to dad about these issues. But the other thing that I said to him at one point, and I think he was a little older by this point, maybe 17, 18, is I said to him, look, your dad does the best that he knows how to do, right? Because we all have our own traumas and our own things from childhood, and we all have parenting things that we don't do great, right? We all, for the most part, are trying to do the best we can. It's just some of us are more capable than others because of our own traumas and how healed we are or aren't from those things. And so one of the things that I really, some people might say, oh, well, that seems like you're almost having sympathy for the other parent. No, I was having sympathy for my kid because I wanted him to understand that it wasn't him, right? There wasn't some shortcoming in him or some dynamic in him. It was like, look, your dad's had certain struggles growing up and it's just made him a certain way. And that unfortunately that is what it is, but it's not you. It's not your fault. It's not anything you did. Right. And just helping him not feel crazy making, because he's being gaslit, right? And all of those things, just like we experience in our own relationships. And those things are harder to deal with when the child's younger. I think when the child comes and expresses those types of crazy making feelings, what you have to do is teach them that it's okay to find their voice, to assert their feelings and how certain things the other parent does makes them feel. They're not allowed to act disrespectful. They're not allowed to misbehave. They're not allowed to do those kind of things, but they can say, hey, mom or dad, when you do this or that, it's very upsetting to me. That's the risk of boys with dads. Now, again, boys with moms, okay, is the dynamic is that they're going to end up with somebody like that. And honestly, I think having other females in their life that they can relate to and that they can, have a different dynamic with is really, really important so that they learn to understand what that healthy female interaction looks like. A lot of times too, if you remarry or you have a new partner or whatever, and I'm not saying you should rush out and do that. That's not my point. But my point is eventually if that does come to fruition, if you're healed and you choose wisely, so another reason for you to do that work in the interim for the sake of your kids, but if you're healed and you choose wisely in a new partner, then that dynamic, if your dad, presumably the new female, because if mom is a narcissist, then it's going to be the new female that's going to have that impact, right? So the new, stepmom or whatever it may be, that person and their ability to have healthy interactions and dynamic becomes key because that can be a contrasting model for the child where the child goes, oh, wait a minute. And, for a boy, if your mom and dad is the narcissistic one, same thing. A new person coming in at some point can help model a healthier dynamic for the children. And again, I'm not saying that partners are the only way to do this. Sometimes there's brothers or sisters or grandparents or, whatever other people that you can have the child interact more with that will sort of create the framework for that healthy dynamic and that healthy interaction. And, I think my late husband, Thomas, when he and I got together, I think that it did have that impact for my boys to where they just saw a different model and they were able to see certain dynamics that were healthier between Thomas and I that weren't present in my first marriage. Those are some of the things that you can do, but I think it's important to reassure your kid that, they're not crazy. It's not that they're not experiencing what they are, but they need to learn how to find their voice and be able to discuss that with their parent or with their other parent, or at the very least, be able to be in therapy. Okay. Because there are ways to counter it. I can tell you that My boys are 30 and 34, and I do not believe that either one of my kids are narcissists. I'm not a therapist, but I think as much as I know about the subject, I would probably be able to tell. So thankfully, nobody's not, and everybody married well. So you can counter, there's a lot of healthy things that you can do to counter the dynamic. So I hope that gives you some hope. If you'd like to get more help with these types of issues, you can go to divorceuniversityonline.com/VIP-coaching. There's information on that page on my group coaching programs for moms and for dads. And there's also information on my premium one-on-one VIP coaching services. If you feel like you need that higher level of help, you can get that information as well. Thanks for joining me. I'll see you next time.